We're continuing our look at science and the Christian tradition. Section 4.9 of Albo focuses on the Big Bang Theory. What was it? Well, it is one of the most widely held scientific theories of our modern days. And it says about 14 billion years ago, the visible universe began expanding from a single extremely hot and dense point. So everything was condensed into this point, and then it just banged out. Okay, that's the scientific creation story that we have today. Does it fit with the creation stories from Genesis 1 to 3? Well, a rationalist, materialist, or determinist, they might say that there's a contradiction, right? Because the Big Bang Theory doesn't have any need for God; it can just happen by itself. They might say by itself. They would say. So there's no evidence of God in the Big Bang Theory, and since a rationalist or a materialist would only believe in something that could be specifically and empirically demonstrated, they would say they're at odds because the Genesis story revolves around the actions of God, and there is no evidence of God in the Big Bang Theory. A fundamentalist, kind of on the other side here, or a literalist Christian, would also see a contradiction. They would say, well, no, Big Bang Theory said the creation of the earth took 14 billion years. It really happened in 6 days. Right? Besides, they got the order all wrong. Right? The earth is not created first. Things like that. But for a Catholic or other non-literalist Christian, and I do realize that there are Catholics who are biblical literist and fundamentalist, but the teaching authority of the church, the bishops, in communion with the Pope, have made it clear, I think, that that is not the way to interpret the Scriptures. So I'm going to say that's the Catholic teaching, and I'm going to say Catholics, at least if they know what the church is actually teaching here, and other non-literalist Christians would not necessarily see a contradiction between the Big Bang Theory and the creation stories from Genesis 3. Why? Because Genesis 3 is not science or history, right? Genesis 3 is a mythopoeic thought. It's a broken myth. It's stories that use symbols to get across meaning. Okay, so Alba goes on to point out that the Big Bang Theory and Genesis 3 have some similarities. Like the universe has a specific beginning and time has a specific beginning. He points out that when the Big Bang Theory first started to gain popularity in the scientific community, a lot of scientists were very wary of it because it looked like it was very religious. It looked like it was going more on the religion side of a creation out of nothing, which they had not assumed in the past. And just a little note I'd like to add in here. I think Abel's getting on this, but I just want to put it a little bit more explicitly here. The science cannot explain here how matter appeared in the single point before it Big Banged. Right? So science doesn't have an answer for that. Right? Now, faith has an answer for that, but it can't prove it. Right? The Christian faith can't say, see, well, you don't know how it was done, so it must have been God. That's not really a rational argument. Right? We're using reason here. We believe that reason is a gift that God gave us that can help us come to know God, and we can use that to know God through science. Come to know the truth of the physical universe that He created, and therefore we can see signs of Him in that, come to know Him through that. But we can't prove His existence using science. All right. So, and also we can't just say because science doesn't understand it, then it must be God. Right. That's the kind of God of the gaps thinking that doesn't lead you anywhere. Because number one, it's not necessarily rational. Just because you don't know how it happened doesn't say, oh well, then it must be God or any other agent. Right. Second of all, as science would discover more and more, you would have less and less space for God. So I'll be warning you frequently throughout this talk not to fall into the God of the gaps kind of thinking. Okay, way back in chapter 3, Abel talked about St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs for the existence of God. Now, today, and for most of history since they came out, people have been saying, wait a minute, that's not really a proof. That doesn't prove God exists. And right, they're not actually proofs like, hey, you can look at these and say, hey, I know that God exists from that. But it does prove that the existence of God is not irrational. Right? It does say, hey, think about this. Wouldn't it be possible? So if we take them that way, we can call them a proof in that sense. The first one is a proof from motion. Everything that is in motion has to be set in motion, right? Like if you see the trash can, it gets blown over by the wind. A cue ball gets hit by another cue ball, and that makes it go. Everything is put into motion, set into motion by something else. So then what started things in motion? Right? So there must be a first mover. There must be this kind of there must be something or someone who started things going in the beginning. So that's the argument from first mover. The second proof for the existence of God is like it. It's the argument from efficient cause, that everything is a cause. Nothing just exists of itself or appears out of thin air. The water bottle was made by someone somewhere. I came from my parents, who came from their parents, who came from their parents, who came from someone or something, right? Everything is coming from something. So then, what did things come from? How did the universe begin, right? It's kind of like if you put it with our contemporary Big Bang theory. Well, what made the single point that the Big Bang banged out of, right? So that's the idea of there must be some first maker of everything. Okay, the third one is kind of similar, but a little bit different. It's the proof of contingency. It says that everything is contingent on something else. Anything that comes into being, it's dependent on other things being other ways, and nothing is necessary. Nothing has to exist. So again, if you're looking at your book now, your book is the way it is. Maybe you do because it was dropped on the floor, because of where it was shipped from, because of how it was produced. Well, there's all these things that it's contingent on. It's dependent on for being the way it is. But at the same time, the book doesn't have to exist, right? It could just as well not exist, right? So again, it's contingent or dependent on other things for its existence. So if this is true, why are there always things existing? Couldn't it be, since nothing's necessary, couldn't there be some kind of time when things just fall out of existence altogether? Well, there must be some necessary being who created the conditions and holds things in being, or sustains the contingency so that things that don't have to exist do exist. The fourth argument, now all three of those you could all three of the first, again, these aren't proofs. You could really ask, well, why does there have to be a first maker? Couldn't there just be an infinite regress of dependent causes? Same thing with motion. Couldn't just motion go infinitely into the past? So again, you have these questions, and the same thing with contingency. Couldn't it just be a constant string of contingent variables without any necessary variable as the foundation? Yeah, you could, again. So these are not proofs in the sense of an undeniable empirical evidence of the existence of God, but they do help you see that the belief in God is rational, does make sense. Right? Finally, from degrees of perfection, right? You see some things are more perfect than others, some things are better, so to speak, than others. So then wouldn't it figure that there is a most perfect, right? That than which nothing greater that can be thought. And that thing then would be God, right? Which would actually not be a thing anymore because the perfections would be beyond being a thing. But that's kind of like a whole different deal. We'll just leave that part out for now. And then finally, proof from design. This is something that we're going to look at in modern form today. And that's the idea that, like, hey, if you see something that has like an ordered design to it, then there must have been some intelligent designer or creator that made it. Okay, so if we look at these contemporary arguments from design, we can see that this is in a certain way in keeping with the Christian tradition. St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, way back in the 1st century, said, "Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes of eternal power and divinity have been able to be understood and perceived in what he has made." We can see signs of God in the world he created. Right? It's very biblical, it's very Christian. Intelligent design will kind of take that idea, and their vision of seeing God in created things is not where they go astray. It's when they claim that they can use created things to prove God's existence. Okay? So if we go with kind of the founder of the contemporary intelligent design argument, we have to look at William Paley, whose 1802 book, Natural Theology, gave this great analogy for the school of thought. And he said, imagine you were like in a field and you were digging in the field or something, you found a watch, right? You wouldn't think that that watch just came together by accident. You would think that someone made the watch and then someone else, buried the watch there or something. Because the watch is so intricate, it wouldn't have happened just as a random result of nature, right? You wouldn't just have all these rocks come together and getting shined into a piece of glass and turning into a watch by chance. No, someone had to take parts and smelt them and put them together and stuff like that to create the watch. A very intricate process. Then he says, now apply that thinking to the human eyeball. The human eyeball is so complex, he said, it wouldn't just happen by itself. There had to be someone who created it or designed it. And so he says, bam, there's your proof for God, the human eyeball. No, you're taking it too far, right? We can't prove that God exists using empirical data, right? We can say, wow, we see signs of God's existence there, but again, you can't prove it, and contemporary science, does have explanations for how eyeballs evolved through natural selection, okay? But even if it didn't, you can't just say, oh, well, you can't prove that it happened. You can't explain how it happened some other way, so it must have happened this way. Right? Another application of the intelligent design theory is in just the observance of the pattern laws of nature. Right? We see crystals forming in an orderly way. We see the planets revolving around the various stars in an orderly way. We see the laws of gravity, right? We see laws of motion. All these things are predictable and orderly, right? And people say, well, why is it all so orderly? Why does it all, fit together? Like, how can we predict, what's going to happen due to the orderly patterns that we see in the universe? And again, we may see that as a sign of God. We might say it might make perfect sense to us, but it's not really proof for God, and that's where intelligent design goes wrong, where they say it proves God exists, right? So, there's some things that science can't explain about the universe, like why it operates in orderly patterns, which is basically the whole subject of science, where they say, wow, look, we can predict what's going to happen now because we've seen it happen before. Then it can't tell us why that happened, right? Just like science can't tell us why the Big Bang happened or, where the point of all the condensed matter came from. So, we can say, well, those things are... we can claim that we can see God at work in that. But, just because science can't prove why it happened, that doesn't mean that the Christian faith or any other religious faith can prove that it was God that did it. Right? We can't prove or disprove God's existence. We can't prove or disprove God's agency in these things. Right? We can see it. We can understand it by faith. Right? Or the atheist can not see it or deny it, by their own kind of faith. But we have to recognize that the faith at work here is not science in the contemporary form. And so that's where you're going to see intelligent design get into some trouble. Another major scientific idea that is at odds with literalist or fundamentalist versions of Christianity, but is not odds with Catholic teaching or other non-literalist versions of Christianity, is evolution, Darwinist evolution, that is, right? So Darwinism is the idea of that an evolution of species came about through random mutation and natural selection. So one of the most famous examples is, hey, human beings descended from a common ancestor as contemporary great apes, right? Does it contradict the Christian faith? Well, again, rationalists are going to say yes, because you don't need God, right, for evolution to work. So they're going to say you don't need God. There's no specific evidence for him, so he's not real. He's not at work there. If you look at the Christian faith and read the creation stories literally, God is the center of them, and He's there. So the rationalists will say, "Yep, those are two contradictory ideas." Darwinism and Genesis 1-3. Fundamentalists and literalist Christians, yes, they would also see a contradiction, because they say, no. In the Bible it says the earth was created in 6 days. God created all the animals. They didn't evolve from lower forms, stuff like that. So they'll see a contradiction there too. But Catholic and other non-literalist Christians, no, there's no contradiction. Because we understand Genesis in a symbolic way, there's no reason that, God couldn't create the world through evolution. As a matter of fact, as we'll see, it kind of fits with our religious view of gradual revelation. Okay, so you have faith groups that attempt to refute Darwinism. Okay, Abel again doesn't call these recent flawed refutations of Darwinism, but that's what I think he's getting at, and so that's what I'm going to call him here in this section. The first one that he talks about is creationism in general, and creationism insists on a literal interpretation of Genesis. I've seen lots of people who adhere to these various forms of creationism, intelligent design, young earth theory, stuff like that, and they often will try to take a very scientific approach or present themselves in a very scientific light, but the reason that they're coming at the reason that they're proposing the theories that they're proposing is always because they are trying to defend a literalist interpretation of Genesis. So one of these forms of creationism is the young Earth theory, and they claim that the Earth is only 10,000 years old. Again, this is to keep it with a literalist interpretation of Genesis. They believe there might be some evolution within a species, but they don't believe that one species evolved into another, because in the Bible it says God created, all the animals. They attempt to, and this is something new. This is something we didn't see with fundamentalist interpretation of Scripture in the past. This is a relatively recent endeavor. It used to just be that people would just say, well, I don't believe the science. I believe what it says in the Bible. But recently, this is a new thing where people are trying to say, well, I can prove that the Bible's right using science. So they try to refute science with science. So what you usually see is they're not doing very good science. For example, the creationists deny, a lot of creationists deny carbon-14 dating, which is the tried scientific method of dating fossils. They claim there's no evidence for cross-species evolution, but the fossil record really does does seem like there is cross-species evolution. I remember one time watching a program on a local channel, a local fundamentalist TV channel, and they, one of the commentators says, well, maybe the reason that dinosaurs are so further down, or maybe the reason that archaeologists find dinosaur bones further down in the ground than human bones, is because maybe like when the dinosaur died, it fell in a hole. You know what I mean, which, yeah, I mean, that's a little bit rational, right? Of course, did they all fall in holes, right? You know, did every dinosaur fossil that they found that made it look like dinosaurs existed billions of years before humans, was that the result of them all falling in holes, right? And there's none that didn't fall in holes, so that they find them in the same level of soil as the human remains? Yeah, no, probably not. So again, it's kind of like, okay, here's scientific evidence, but it's like not very good. It's very selective, and a lot of it's just fraudulent. But it's like, if you want to believe that, then it kind of looks rational. But why do you want to believe it? Well, they want to believe it because they want to maintain a literalist interpretation of Scripture. Intelligent design is a creationist movement that has had some popularity, especially in the United States. And again, it's like we talked about already. It is in keeping with the Christian tradition. Again, we do see signs of God's presence in God's creation. But this form of intelligent design that's popular in the United States is based on a literalist interpretation of Scripture. So they're kind of trying to use these arguments from design to prove God exists. And so again, it doesn't work. It's the kind of that God of the gas thing, you know, saying, well, that we don't know how evolution would have done that, so it must be God. Again, it's not scientific, right? It's fine, like to make arguments from design, but to claim that they offer some kind of scientific proof is erroneous. And you saw an interesting case in some of the Kansas school boards. The school boards voted to include intelligent design as part of the science curriculum. And so then one former, I think it was a former Kansas resident, invented this kind of satiric or fake religion called flying spaghetti monsterism or Pastafarianism. And he petitioned the school board to have his theory on the creation of the universe included in the classroom. So that's where the whole flying spaghetti monsterism comes from. And it really was kind of an entertaining and interesting way to make a point, which is basically that intelligent design, which is actually faith in a literalist interpretation of scriptures, it's not science, right? So it's not that it was necessarily an objection to religion or a satire of all religion, but the point was well made here that you can't present faith which does not have the kind of empirical proof that science has as science, right? Faith does have evidence, faith does have reasons, but they're not the kind of things you can test in a lab like you test science if you're doing the scientific method properly. So that's, if nothing else, intelligent design at least gave birth to the very entertaining, satirical religion of Pastafarianism. Okay, there's another theory which treats faith and religion as non-overlapping magisteria. That is saying that faith and religion, they just cover two different, separate realms. They're non-overlapping. Religion talks about the meaning of things, and faith is just, science is just dealing with the physical aspect of the universe. Pope John Paul II said, there's something to this. They are distinct. Science and religion are distinct. Religion is talking more about the meaning of things. It's connecting us with things we can't test empirically. But you can't really say that they're not relating or that they don't overlap, because all truth is related, right? All truth is from God, and all truth expresses God. So John Paul II's vision was that science and religion should come together to form a greater unified vision, right? Kind of again like the blind man and the elephant. You can see the danger of separating science and faith too much. When you would just see technology without ethics, right? If people are just saying, well, we're just doing science here, and not asking, well, why are we doing this science? Is this actually good for people? Should we do this? All these questions that we have with medical ethics, bioethics, all the different scientific ethical fields, kind of show that we can't separate these things too much, right? Everything within the scientific world, how we learn about the objective nature of the universe, so to speak. This is also going to have to do with the religious world, how we experience the subjective nature of the universe. So what does the Catholic Church teach about Darwin's theory of evolution? Well, way back in 1950, Pius XII said it's okay to believe in physical evolution, but he was weary about people interpreting evolution of the soul. He wanted to make sure that people understood, hey, the soul is created immediately by God. In 1985, John Paul II said that if you understand creation in the right way, then it doesn't contradict with the theory of evolution if you understand that in the right way, right? So this gave legitimacy in a certain sense, or it's not like it was a new idea, but this was a statement of the possibility of theistic evolution, right? That you could believe in evolution and believe in God, right? You simply believe that God is working through evolution. That is well in keeping with the Christian tradition, right? Pope Francis made a good point a few years ago. He said evolution in nature is not inconsistent with the notion of creation, because evolution requires the creation of beings that evolve, right? So in other words, evolution is a way that God creates, right? It's a way that he took us from dirt, so to speak, as the imagery of the Genesis stories tell us. Okay, now Abel poses some questions to evolutionists, right, or evolutionism, and we're talking here about an evolutionary theory that denies the existence of God, like an evolutionary rationalism or an evolutionary materialism. There are some questions it hasn't answered. Now, please don't get excited. Don't go overboard here and say, oh, well, evolution can't show us how life came to be, therefore God must have created it. Again, no, not necessarily. Of course, we see God working in and through creation if we have faith, right, based on our own experience and the experiences of others. But it's not proof in the contemporary scientific sense, all right? So you have to be careful about that God of the gaps thing. If you say, well, if science doesn't know what it is, then it must be God. Well, again, not really. That's not actually true. There could be different explanations for it. And number two, just because science doesn't understand it yet, right, doesn't mean that it won't later. Okay. So some of the things that evolutionism hasn't explained yet: the origins of life, how we got from non-living material to living things. Also, he doesn't specifically mention this, but I'll throw it in here: the jump from single-cellular organisms to multicellular organisms. It's not that science can't explain it; it's just so random that it doesn't seem likely, according to scientific theory. It was a very unlikely event, so to speak. Again, doesn't prove God did it, but it does make you question the science. Or question, let's say, the majesty of science or something, or question, or it might save you from thinking that science is infallible and that science always gets things right all the time. Right? There are some things science doesn't explain. Second of all, self-awareness. Abel mentions this. I'm not sure if he's understands the same way I am, but when you talk about self-awareness, like the question comes up, like, if all of reality is just this chain of contingent cause and effect, right? How is it that our consciousness has any moment of that cause and effect, right? Like if I'm just in the chain and whatever happened in my within the neurons in my brain, within the chemical processes, right, within the atoms, is passing on from moment to moment. How is it that I somehow in awareness step outside that moment and see myself as the chain of events? Right? In other words, how would a link in the chain, if it's just one link, how does it see itself as the whole chain? Again, it doesn't prove anything, but it's something that science doesn't have a good answer for yet, at least. And then finally, does physical causation eliminate intentional causation? Right. This is an argument about like that. There's kind of two kinds of causation, and the scientific materialists or rationalists who deny God's existence because God isn't necessary to explain the existence of things scientifically. They may be making a mistake here about like what causes things, right? So you have a physical causation, like for example, if someone's writing, like what causes the words on the page? Well, the pen being pushed against the page and the ball of the pen rolling and the ink coming out. That is the physical cause. But couldn't you also say like the writer's intention, right, to write what they want to write? Isn't that also the cause? Right? So just because you can explain the physical origins of something, that doesn't eliminate the cause or the will that could be acting through that. Makes sense? It's like if you're talking on your phone, you're like, well, what's causing the voice to come out of my phone? Well, you could say, well, there's the radio waves that are being transmitted, from the satellite and then translated by the various computer elements and chips in my phone, stuff like that. Then it's coming out through the speaker. It's creating a sound waves through the motion of the speaker. That you can explain it physically, but you could also say, well, what's causing the voice to come out of my phone is my mother calling me, to because she wants me to come over for dinner. Right? So again, it's two different kinds of causes. One does not exclude the other. Just because you can explain the physical origins of the universe doesn't mean that there's not some will that's working through those physical means. Our will being expressed through those physical means. Okay, just a final warning here. Like, again, we're talking about science and faith. Be careful of slipping into a God of the gaps mentality, right? Just because science doesn't have an explanation for something does not prove that God did it, right? It just says we don't know. Okay. Now, of course, someone with faith is going to see God in everything, and so it might be easier to see God in things you don't understand by science. But don't remember, just because something has a scientific explanation, that doesn't mean God's not doing it, right? It doesn't prove he's doing it either, right? But it doesn't mean he's not. So we should remember that we can't prove or disprove God's existence using the scientific method. And we should be careful not to abandon the gift of reason for blind faith in either science or religion. Right? It leads to bad science, and it leads to maybe worse religion. Right? Remember, reason is God's gift to us, right? And we can use it to know him.